I lived in a small town by the sea, a place where the wind carried the salty scent of the ocean and the horizon stretched out endlessly before me. Michael and I had built our life there. We had poured our love and effort into this little cottage, making it our home. The garden in the back, the front porch where we would sit in the evenings with a glass of wine, the kitchen where we'd cook together, everything in that house held memories of our life, our happiness. We used to wake up to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below, and the light streaming through the windows would warm our faces as we shared breakfast. It was our sanctuary, our perfect little world. But that world was shattered when Michael died. It was a rainy evening when I got the call. A car accident. The words hit me like a slap to the face, hard and fast. It felt like everything around me collapsed. One minute, I was thinking about dinner, wondering if Michael would be home soon, and the next, I was standing in a hospital room, hearing that he was gone. Just like that. The love of my life, my partner, my everything, was no longer with me. The days that followed felt like a blur. People came to offer their condolences, but it all felt like a strange, distant noise. I felt like I was moving through life in a fog, unable to connect with anything around me. The house that had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and shared moments now stood still, suffocating under the weight of silence. The absence of Michael's presence was a constant ache in my chest. Every corner, every piece of furniture seemed to whisper his name. Even the air felt colder without him. I tried to go through the motions of living, but it was hard. Too hard. I'd go to the store, return to the same routine, but it felt empty. Nothing felt right anymore. The house, which had once been so alive, now seemed like a mausoleum, a tomb that held the echoes of our past. Every room I entered, I could still hear his voice, see his smile, and feel his touch, but it was all gone. The memories, once so vivid, now stung with the sharpness of loss. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, watching the same sunsets we had enjoyed together. But now, they only reminded me of what I had lost. The sound of the waves, which used to comfort me, now felt like a constant reminder of the vast emptiness that had taken over my heart. There were times when I didn't even know why I kept going. What was the point of it all when the person who meant everything to me was no longer here? And yet, somehow, I kept moving. I kept waking up every morning, putting one foot in front of the other. It wasn't living, not really, but it was surviving. I told myself that I had to keep going. I had to keep Michael's memory alive, but more than anything, I had to find a way to fill the void that he had left behind. But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to ignore the reality. I was alone. I was surrounded by all these memories, but they only served to make the loneliness more unbearable. The days blurred together, each one passing in the same quiet, empty rhythm, and I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. But what could I do? Where could I go? That's when the idea came to me. I had to move. I had to find somewhere that wasn't filled with echoes of the past, somewhere I could start fresh. It wasn't about forgetting Michael, it was about finding a way to move forward, to stop drowning in my own grief. But when I thought of where to go, there was only one place that made sense: Emily. She was my only child, the one person I thought would understand. I wasn't asking to live with her, just to be closer, to feel like part of something again. I needed to stop feeling so damn alone. I needed to stop feeling like I was just waiting for something to happen, to feel some kind of connection with the world again. But what happened next was the last thing I expected. I tried. I really did. After Michael died, I told myself I had to keep going. I couldn't just curl up and fade away. He wouldn't want that. So I went back to the bookstore. It was the one place that had always felt like home. A place where I could lose myself in the pages of a book, or in the small talks with the few regulars who came in for their morning coffee. The smell of old paper, the comforting hum of quiet conversation, it used to be a sanctuary, a place full of life. But now it felt hollow. The store didn't feel like the same place anymore. The shelves still held the same books, arranged the same way, but they no longer had the same magic. The laughter I once shared with Michael over quirky customer interactions was gone. The quiet moments we used to spend together, sitting behind the counter, were replaced by an aching emptiness. Every time I reached for a book, it was like my hand was reaching into the past, touching a memory, but never finding what I was looking for. The shop, which once felt full of energy and warmth, now felt as cold and distant as the house I had left behind. The bell above the door still jingled when customers came in, but every sound in that shop was drowned out by the silence in my mind. It was as though I was just going through the motions, a body in a store that no longer held any meaning. I'd watch the clock tick by, wishing for the day to end, only to go home to the same empty house. Each hour stretched out, slow and endless. And as I closed up each evening, I'd find myself staring at the door, hoping for something or someone to change the quiet that seemed to cling to everything. But nothing changed. Nothing ever changed. I started to feel a kind of loneliness that was deeper than I had ever known. At first, I thought it was just grief. After all, who wouldn't feel alone after losing the person they loved most? But as the days went on, I realized it was more than that. It wasn't just about losing Michael. It was about how alone I was in this world now. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of connection. I had no one left, not truly. And it was then, in that stillness, that I began to feel vulnerable. I had never been one to show weakness. I prided myself on being strong, on being independent, on carrying the weight of everything without asking for help. But now, every moment felt like I was just waiting to break. I wasn't just grieving, I was drowning in it. And the worst part was that I didn't know how to escape it. I realized, with an uncomfortable jolt, that I was more fragile than I had ever allowed myself to believe. I had spent so many years being the one who held everything together, for Michael, for Emily, for everyone around me. I was always the rock. But now, that rock was crumbling, and I wasn't sure what to do with the pieces that were left. I needed something, someone, anything to pull me out of this. But when I reached for help, the only thing I got was silence. And that silence, that indifference, was louder than any noise I could imagine. As I sat there in the store, watching the clock tick closer to closing time, I knew that something had to change. But I also knew, deep down, that the change wasn't going to come from anyone else. It was going to have to come from me. But how could I change when I didn't even know who I was anymore? How could I fix what had been broken for so long, when all I felt was this crushing weight on my chest, this overwhelming emptiness? I didn't have the answers then. But I knew one thing, I couldn't keep living this way. Something inside me was awakening, something dark and determined. I wasn't just going to sit here, waiting for the world to fix me. I wasn't just going to let this hurt swallow me whole. I had been strong before. I had been strong for everyone else. Now I was going to be strong for me. And so, the idea began to form, quietly at first, like a seed planted in the back of my mind, waiting to grow. I had to make a choice. A choice that would change everything. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice the small things that used to go unnoticed. Things I had taken for granted. At first, it was just a slight ache in my knee. A dull throb that would come and go, but nothing that seemed too alarming. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the aging process. I could handle it. I had always been strong, always been able to push through. But soon, the pain wasn't something I could ignore anymore. It became constant. It started in the morning, a stiff, aching feeling in my joints as I tried to get out of bed. The cold air in the house, now that the weather was changing, seemed to sink into my bones. I winced every time I stood up. But I told myself, it's just arthritis, Sarah. It's nothing you can't handle. But the truth was, it was becoming harder to do simple things. I couldn't walk as far as I used to, couldn't climb the stairs without pausing to catch my breath. Each step felt heavier than the last. And then, there was my vision. At first, it was just a little blurry when I tried to read, but I brushed it off. It's nothing, I thought. But it wasn't nothing. The world around me seemed to blur more and more each day, the once sharp edges of things becoming soft and indistinct. Reading the books in my store became a struggle, something I never thought I'd have to face. My fingers would hover over the pages, my eyes squinting, trying to make out the words that once came to me so easily. I couldn't even see the price tags on the books without squinting, couldn't spot the customers who came in without straining my eyes. Every time I tried to focus on something, it felt like I was living in a fog, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it off. The once vibrant, colorful world I had loved to explore now felt faded. My independence, the thing I had always prided myself on, was slipping away in the quietest, most insidious way. The very idea of needing help from anyone was unbearable. I had spent my whole life being the one to take care of others, and now I was the one in need. That thought hit me harder than anything. I remember the moment I realized I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. It was a Tuesday, and I had gone to the grocery store. I parked the car, but when I tried to get out, the pain in my knee shot up my leg, and I almost fell. I had to clutch the side of the car for support. The realization hit me in that moment, like a sudden wave crashing over me. I wasn't going to be able to keep living this way. I couldn't keep relying on my strength when it was failing me. I wasn't able to drive anymore, not safely at least. I couldn't do the things I had always done. The very idea of continuing in this slow, agonizing spiral terrified me. I had always been so independent, and now I was losing that. I could feel it slipping away from me like sand through my fingers. I stood there, gripping the side of the car, staring at the store in front of me, and a single thought kept circling in my mind. This isn't living. I couldn't keep pretending that I was okay when I wasn't. I couldn't keep ignoring the truth that my body, once strong and reliable, was betraying me. I couldn't live like this anymore. It was then that I knew something had to change. I didn't know exactly what that change would look like, but I knew I couldn't keep going down this path. I was afraid of what that change might mean, but more than that, I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't make it. I had already felt so disconnected from everything, so lost in the quiet of my own mind. I was on the edge of something I didn't quite understand yet, but I felt it coming. I needed to take control. Somehow, I had to find a way to make my life mine again. I needed to make a decision, and it needed to be mine. The thought of asking for help from Emily, from anyone, made my stomach churn, but it was becoming clear that I had to do something. I couldn't do it alone, not anymore. I had spent so many years looking after everyone else, Michael, Emily, always putting them first, always making sure they were taken care of. But now, as I stood there, struggling just to make it through a simple trip to the store, I realized that I had forgotten to take care of myself. And that had to change. The next step was clear. I had to make a decision for myself. I had to be the one to take charge of my life. I was scared, more than I had ever been in my life, but I knew that if I didn't do it now, I might lose everything. My independence, my dignity, my sense of who I was. And that was the one thing I couldn't let go of. I sat there one evening, staring at the old wooden table that Michael and I had shared so many meals at. The empty chair across from me felt more like a reminder of his absence than just a simple piece of furniture. The stillness in the house was suffocating, and the weight of my own thoughts seemed to fill every corner of the room. I had been thinking a lot lately about my life, about how things had changed, and about what I needed now that everything felt so different. As I sat there, I thought of Emily, my only child. She had always been the light of my life, the one thing I could always count on. I remember the days when she was little, her laughter filling this house, running around with energy I could barely keep up with. She was a good girl, the kind of daughter who always tried to make me proud, though we never had the kind of closeness I always dreamed of. But as she grew up, got married, and started her own family, I found that the space between us grew too. She was busy. She had her own life, her own responsibilities. And while I was still here, holding on to the past, she had moved forward. I'd visit her in Boston every now and then, and though she would always welcome me with open arms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just a visitor, an obligation that she had to fulfill rather than someone she truly wanted close. I wasn't angry with her, not really. I understood. Life gets complicated. She had a husband, children, a career. But I also couldn't ignore the growing emptiness that seemed to creep into my heart every time I left her house and returned to this quiet, lonely place. I needed something more. I needed to feel connected again. It wasn't just about the help I needed around the house or with my daily tasks. It was deeper than that. I needed the comfort of family, the feeling of being part of something, of being seen. I needed to feel like I mattered again. And for the first time since Michael's death, I thought, maybe it was time to stop living in this old house, holding on to a life that no longer existed. Maybe it was time to make a change. I wasn't ready to live with Emily and her family. I didn't want to be a burden to her, not the way I had seen others burden their children. She had her own life to manage, her own responsibilities. But I wanted to be close to her, close enough to share moments, to have dinner together sometimes, to not feel like I was so far removed from the people who meant the most to me. I wanted to be near Emily, but not in a way that would take away from her life. I didn't want to intrude, to make her feel like she had to take care of me. I just wanted to feel like I was part of her world again, to feel that connection. I longed for the kind of bond that mothers and daughters were supposed to have, the kind of love that wasn't overshadowed by distance and years apart. So, I made a decision. I would move to a small apartment near Boston, close enough that I could see Emily whenever I needed to, but far enough away that I wouldn't be living in her space, in her home, taking up her time. I wasn't sure exactly where I would go yet, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in this house anymore, surrounded by memories that were too painful to keep reliving. The thought of leaving the house, the place where I had spent so many years with Michael, was daunting. It felt like I was turning my back on the past, on everything I had known. But I also knew it was the right thing to do. I needed to move forward, to be closer to the people I loved, even if it was just for a small part of my life. I called a realtor the next day, and as I spoke to her, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't abandoning the memories of my life with Michael. I was simply creating space for new memories. It was time to move on. I had to let go of the past in order to give myself the chance to live again. And so, I made the call to Emily. I told her that I was thinking of moving closer, to an apartment not far from Boston, where I could still be near her, but without intruding. I didn't ask her to take me in. I didn't want to ask for that kind of help. I just wanted to be closer, to have the warmth of her presence in my life again. She was quiet for a moment before she said, "I think that's a good idea, Mom. We can visit more often, and it'll be easier for you, too." Her voice sounded distant, but it wasn't cold. It was filled with a kind of understanding, a kind of acceptance. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she wasn't saying. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. I knew this was the right decision. I had made it for myself. But as I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the empty street, I couldn't help but wonder if I was making the right decision for the relationship with my daughter. I wanted to believe that being close to her would bring us closer, but part of me feared that the distance between us, the unspoken distance, might never truly disappear. Still, it was a step. And in that moment, it felt like the only step I could take. The phone rang in my hand, the quiet hum of the call filling the space around me. I stared at the screen for a moment before I hit the green button, taking a deep breath. I had thought about this call for days, running through it in my mind over and over, but nothing could prepare me for the moment when I actually spoke to her. "Hi, Emily," I said, my voice soft, careful. I didn't want her to hear the nervousness that fluttered in my chest. I had to do this. "It's Mom. I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to talk to you." There was a slight pause, the sound of rustling in the background before she spoke. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" Her voice was light, a little distracted. I could hear the clink of dishes, the murmur of children in the distance. "I've been feeling like I need a change, after everything. It's been so hard living in this house by myself. I was thinking, maybe it's time for me to move closer to you," I said, trying to sound casual, though my words felt heavy in my mouth. "Not to live with you, of course. Just nearby, where I can be close by, in case I need help, or just to feel like I'm not so alone." The silence on the other end of the line seemed to stretch for a moment too long, like the air had thickened. I could hear her sigh and my heart sank. "I don't know, Mom," she finally said, her tone shifting, colder. "You know, Daniel and I have talked about it before. We're really busy. We have the kids, my work, everything. It's just a lot, and we can't really take on more right now." Her words hit me like a slap, but I didn't respond immediately. I just waited, letting the silence hang there for a moment. "What do you mean?" I wanted to ask. "I'm your mother. Aren't I worth more than this?" But I stayed quiet, hoping she would soften. Instead, I heard Daniel's voice in the background, loud and clear, cutting through the phone line. "Emily, we're not running an elderly hostel here." "She can figure it out," Daniel said, his voice sharp, dismissive. My stomach tightened at his words, and my chest felt hollow. An elderly hostel. He spoke about me like I was a burden, something to be dealt with, something unwanted. I waited, expecting Emily to stand up for me, to tell him to be more considerate, to defend me in some way. But instead, I heard her sigh deeply, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke again. "I'm sorry, Mom, I don't think we can deal with this right now," she said. The weight of those words crushed me. The finality in her voice, the way she so easily dismissed me, made it clear. I wasn't a priority. I wasn't even a consideration. I had spent my life raising her, loving her, supporting her, and now, when I needed something simple, a little support, a little understanding, she was telling me that it was too much. That I was too much. I held the phone in my hand, my fingers trembling, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? What could I say when the person I thought would care the most didn't? I finally whispered, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, "I understand. Thanks anyway, Emily." And with that, I hung up. The sound of the dial tone echoed in my ear, and for a long moment I just stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, not moving. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was just empty. I had hoped for more. I had hoped that after everything, Emily would want to help, to have me near. But instead, I had gotten a cold, indifferent rejection. And then, in the silence of the house, it hit me. I wasn't wanted. Not by Emily, not by Daniel, not by anyone. I wasn't a part of their lives anymore. I had been foolish to think things would be different. Foolish to think they would be there for me when I needed them the most. But that was the moment I realized something else, something far more important. I didn't need them. If they couldn't see me, if they couldn't love me when I needed it most, then I didn't need to try anymore. I was done seeking approval, done asking for help from people who couldn't give it. It was time to take control. It was time to make my own decisions, to stop relying on others to fill the void they had left in my life. And as I stood there, in the cold silence of the house, I knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the phone still warm in my hand, the faint buzz of the dial tone ringing in my ears. The room was silent, too silent, and the weight of the moment was suffocating. My heart was beating erratically in my chest, each thud a reminder of the words that had just been spoken, the ones that cut through me like a knife. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't think we can deal with this right now." Those words, they echoed in my mind over and over. Deal with this right now. It wasn't a question of needing help. It wasn't a request for an emotional connection. It wasn't even about me as a person. It was as if I was something to be handled, something to be managed, like an inconvenience. But what hurt most of all was the tone, the flatness in Emily's voice, the lack of care. How easily she dismissed me, as though I had never mattered, as though everything we had shared, her childhood, our talks, the years of me taking care of her, meant nothing now. And then, to hear Daniel's voice, cold and callous, making it clear that I was nothing but a burden. "We're not running an elderly hostel." The words replayed in my mind, over and over like an uninvited guest. A burden, a hostel. It was as though I had been erased from the life of the very person I had raised, erased from the life of my own flesh and blood. Hadn't I given everything to them? Hadn't I spent my entire life making sure they were safe, loved, and cared for? I had spent my years building a family, putting their needs before my own, nurturing them, loving them with everything I had. And now, when I needed them, when I was facing a world without Michael, without the one person who had always been by my side, they couldn't even spare me the smallest amount of compassion. I let out a shaky breath, the weight of the realization pressing down on me. I've been forgotten, that's what it felt like. Not just rejected, but erased from Emily's life. As if my existence, my years of sacrifice, no longer held any meaning to her. I thought about all the years I had been there for her, all the times I'd dropped everything to support her. And now, when it was my turn, she was choosing to shut me out. The tears came then, slow at first, like a trickle from a broken dam. They weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of loss. Not for Michael, not just for the life we had built together, but for the daughter I had poured my heart into, for the person I thought would always care. Why, Emily? I whispered to myself, though I knew no one would answer. Why couldn't you just care enough to help me, to be there when I needed you? But the truth was, I already knew the answer. She had her own life now, a family, a home, a future that didn't include me. I had been a part of her past, but now I was just a footnote, a distant memory, and it hurt more than I could ever explain. I felt so small in that moment. Small and insignificant, as if I had been discarded, placed aside like an old book no one wanted to read anymore. And the worst part, I felt like I didn't have the right to ask for more. Maybe I had been selfish, thinking she would still need me the way I needed her. Maybe it was foolish to think she could ever see me as someone worthy of her time and attention once she had everything she wanted. But it didn't stop the pain. It didn't stop the feeling that I had been forgotten. I wiped my eyes and sat there in silence, unable to shake the feeling that I had been erased, like I had no place left in her world. The woman who had held her hand through everything, who had been her rock, was now the one left alone in the quiet of a house that no longer felt like home. But in the midst of the hurt, something else began to stir inside me. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something darker, something more powerful. A quiet, determined feeling that told me I would not let this be my fate. I would not let myself disappear into nothingness. I couldn't change what had just happened, but I could change how I responded. I could still choose to take control of my life. I didn't have to let this rejection define me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized. I had been looking in the wrong direction for my worth. It wasn't in Emily's hands. It wasn't in the hands of anyone else. It was in my own hands. And so, with the sting of that rejection still fresh, I made a choice. I would stop waiting for them to see me. I would stop waiting for them to decide whether I was important. I would show them that I didn't need their approval, and I didn't need their help. I had the strength to keep going. I had the power to live my life on my own terms, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me, not even my own daughter. The decision came quickly, though it wasn't easy. After that phone call with Emily, after the coldness, after realizing how little I truly mattered to her, everything changed. I looked around the house, the place Michael and I had built together, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it no longer belonged to me. For so long, it had been our sanctuary. The creaky floorboards, the soft light filtering through the kitchen window, the garden we'd tended together, everything in this house had been a part of us. A part of our love. But now, all it felt like was an empty shell, echoing with the ghosts of memories I could never escape. I had spent so many years taking care of everyone, trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife. And now, when I needed support, when I needed to feel loved and wanted, I was left alone in a house that had once been filled with life, now suffocating under the weight of silence. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't keep clinging to a past that no longer existed. Michael was gone, and Emily, my only child, had made it clear that I wasn't welcome in her life. I was no longer part of their world, and maybe it was time to stop pretending that I was. So I made the decision. I called a real estate agent, told her to come by and help me sell the house. When she arrived, I walked her through the rooms, each step feeling heavier than the last. The kitchen, where we used to sit together in the mornings. The living room where Michael would read the paper. The hallway that led to the bedroom we had shared for so many years. Each corner seemed to whisper his name, but as I looked around, all I could feel was emptiness. The agent was kind, but I could sense her hesitation as she looked around. "It's a beautiful house," she said, her tone neutral, "but it's clear it's seen better days. You'll need to make some repairs to get the best price." I nodded, though I wasn't listening. What did it matter? The house wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the past. I signed the papers, and just like that, the house that had once been the center of my world was no longer mine. The day I handed over the keys, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking one last look at the place I had called home for 40 years. I didn't cry, though the tears were there, waiting. I was just numb. The drive to my new apartment was quiet. The city felt so different, so unfamiliar. I had never imagined myself leaving, never imagined I would be here, in a place where no one knew my name, where I could be anyone and no one at the same time. The apartment was small, but it was mine. There was something comforting about it, something freeing. No memories of a life I couldn't get back. No echoes of Michael's laughter or the sound of Emily's voice from when she was a child, just space. Clean, empty space. The apartment was located in a neighborhood that was far enough from the bustle of the city, but close enough that I could walk to the market or the cafe whenever I needed to. There was a small park nearby, and I often found myself sitting on a bench, just watching the people go by. They didn't know me, and I didn't know them, but there was something soothing about the anonymity of it all. I started going to the local library, where I'd read books and sit in the quiet, peaceful corners. I even joined a small book club at the senior center. There were other women there, all of them much older than me, but they made me feel like I wasn't so alone anymore. They shared stories about their families, about the years they had lived, and in a strange way, I began to feel a connection to them. Not a deep connection, but enough to remind me that I wasn't invisible. I wasn't forgotten. But the loneliness still lingered, a quiet ache that never quite went away. I missed Michael every single day. I missed the way he'd take my hand in the evening, the sound of his voice calling me from the other room, the way he used to fix things around the house, even when he didn't know how. Those little moments, the ones I had taken for granted, were the hardest to let go of. I thought about calling Emily. I thought about reaching out, asking if she wanted to come visit, or if she'd finally be open to talking. But I didn't. I knew the answer before I even picked up the phone. I wasn't part of her life anymore, and no matter how much I wished it were different, I had to accept that. So, I focused on the new life I was building. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't what I had envisioned, but it was mine. I was living for myself now, not for anyone else. And for the first time in a long time, I began to feel something that was almost like hope. Maybe I had made the right decision. Maybe this new life, this quiet, simple life, would give me the peace I had been searching for. Maybe, just maybe, I could begin again. I sat in the small, new apartment, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the steam rising in soft tendrils that matched the quiet thoughts in my mind. It had been a few months since I sold the house, since I left the life I knew behind, but the emptiness still lingered like an old wound that never quite healed. I had moved, yes. I had made a fresh start, but it wasn't the escape I thought it would be. It wasn't the clean break I had hoped for. When I made the decision to leave, I thought I was escaping the ghosts of my past, Michael's death, Emily's cold rejection, the suffocating silence that had filled my home. But the truth was, I was running away from something more, my own sense of dependence. I had spent so much of my life taking care of others, making sure they were all right, ensuring their happiness. I had forgotten that I needed to take care of myself, that I needed to live for me. But now, as I sat in this quiet apartment, the weight of what had happened sank in. I wasn't just running away from the house or from memories of Michael. I was running from the fear that I had become a burden. A burden to Emily. A burden to anyone who cared about me. The rejection from Emily stung in ways I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just her refusal to take me in. It was the way she made me feel like I didn't matter. Like I was just one more responsibility she couldn't handle. And when Daniel spoke about me as though I were a burden, it confirmed a truth I had been trying so hard to deny. I had become something to be managed, something that people only cared for when it was convenient for them. That idea, the idea of being a burden, had stayed with me like a shadow, clouding my thoughts, making me second-guess every decision I made. I wasn't ready to be that person. I wasn't ready to let anyone look at me and see only someone they had to take care of. I had always been the strong one, the one who made sure everything was running smoothly. But now, it felt like the world had turned its back on me, and all I was left with was my own weakness. But as I sat there, looking out at the city street below, I realized something. I didn't want to live like that anymore. I didn't want to live in a way that made me feel small, invisible, like I was just something to be taken care of. I had spent my whole life making sacrifices for the people I loved, but where had that gotten me? Emily had moved on, Michael was gone, and now I was here, alone with my thoughts, my regrets, and my fear. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't let that fear define me. I didn't want to be someone's burden. I didn't want to be pitied or looked at like I was less than I had been. I didn't need anyone to take care of me, not Emily, not anyone. I was going to live my life on my own terms, without asking for help from those who couldn't be there when I needed them. The idea of independence was scary, though. It felt like I was stripping away the last bit of connection I had to the world, but it was also the only thing that made sense. I had already been living in a house full of memories, full of expectations I could never live up to. The thought of asking Emily, of relying on her, of depending on anyone else, felt like a betrayal to the woman I used to be, the woman who had stood tall, who had held her family together. I wasn't ready to give up that part of myself, not for anyone, and so I made a choice. I would live the rest of my life independently. I wouldn't ask for help unless it was absolutely necessary. I would not burden anyone else with my problems. If I had to struggle, I would do it alone. And if that meant living in this small apartment, working through the loneliness, finding new ways to fill the silence, then so be it. I didn't need to be surrounded by people to feel alive. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. I would prove to myself that I could still live. I could still be strong. I could still move forward, even if it meant walking alone. It was a quiet resolution, a promise I made to myself in the stillness of that apartment. I would find my own way. I would build my own future without relying on anyone. Not out of bitterness or anger, but because I had learned the hardest lesson of all. My worth was not defined by the help I received from others. It was defined by how I chose to live my life, by the decisions I made, and by the strength I still had inside me. I had been knocked down, but I wasn't broken. I was just beginning to rebuild, and I wasn't going to let anyone or anything take that away from me. The days that followed Emily's cold response felt like a blur. I went through the motions, pretending that I wasn't still replaying her words in my mind, pretending that I wasn't still stinging from the rejection. But every time I looked around at the empty apartment, at the silence that filled the space, I couldn't escape the truth. I had been cast aside, and though I had tried to keep it together, a part of me was beginning to change. The hurt, the betrayal, it simmered quietly beneath the surface, pushing me to a decision I hadn't fully realized I was ready to make. The decision came slowly, like a shadow creeping into the corners of my thoughts. I'd always been someone who believed in the importance of family. I had raised Emily with everything I had, given her the best parts of me. I had always believed that my love for her would be returned, that when I needed help, she would be there. But when she and Daniel turned their backs on me, I began to see things more clearly. I had spent my life giving, sacrificing, always putting the needs of others ahead of my own. But in return, I had received nothing but indifference. I had asked for so little, and yet, when I needed them the most, they couldn't even offer me a little compassion. And that's when I realized something. I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. Not when they had shown me, so clearly, how little they cared. One evening, as I sat at my small kitchen table, my fingers tracing the edges of a letter from a local charity that supported women who had been abandoned by their families, I made up my mind. It wasn't enough to simply feel hurt. It wasn't enough to simply distance myself. I needed to take action. A quiet, subtle action that would make sure Emily and Daniel knew the cost of their indifference. I wasn't going to leave them a single penny. I pulled out the will that had been sitting untouched in my desk for years, the one I had carefully crafted when Michael and I first bought the house, the one that would leave everything to Emily, all of it. The house, the savings, the little bits of jewelry I had collected over the years, everything I had worked for. But now it was time to make changes. I called my lawyer the next morning. "I need to change my will," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "I no longer want to leave anything to Emily. Everything should go to charity." He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Are you sure about this, Sarah? I know it's been a difficult time." "Yes," I interrupted, my voice clear. "I'm sure. I want everything to go to a cause that will actually make a difference. I want it to go to a charity that helps women who have been abandoned by their families. And I want the rest to go to a nursing home, a place that takes care of the elderly who are left behind, people like me, people who have no one." My lawyer's voice softened, a trace of concern lingering in his words. "Sarah, this is a significant decision. Are you sure this is how you want to handle things?" "Yes," I said again, more firmly this time. "I don't want Emily to think that she can inherit anything from me just because she's my daughter. I want her to understand what it feels like to be forgotten, to be cast aside. Let her know that when you abandon someone, when you don't care about them, there are consequences." There was a long pause before my lawyer spoke again. "Understood. I'll prepare the necessary documents. I'll make sure it's all in order." And so, the decision was made. The will was rewritten, and the assets that had once been promised to Emily were now directed to causes that would help those who truly needed it. The women in shelters, the elderly in nursing homes, these were the people who had been forgotten by their families, abandoned like I had been. But I didn't stop there. I knew Emily would find out about the changes eventually. And when she did, I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had lost. I wanted her to understand the gravity of turning her back on me, of seeing me as nothing but a nuisance. I wanted her to feel the sting of losing everything she thought she could inherit simply because she couldn't spare me a little kindness. And as the days passed, the changes were finalized. The charity received the funds, the nursing home would benefit from the estate, and Emily would be left with nothing. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about showing her that I wasn't a fool. I wasn't someone to be discarded. I wasn't going to let my own daughter's cold indifference define me. In the end, I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I only needed to know that I was still in control, that I still had the power to make decisions about my life, my legacy, my worth. And with that, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not joy, not satisfaction, but a quiet knowing that I had taken back something precious, my dignity. I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls as I thought about what I needed to do. I had made my decision, one that felt final, one that was mine to make, but there was one last thing I needed to do, one last way to make sure Emily understood. I couldn't call her. I couldn't bring myself to speak to her again, not after everything that had happened. The last conversation, the indifference, the coldness, it still echoed in my mind. But I knew I had to communicate the reason for my actions, the reason I had made the changes I had. I wasn't doing it out of spite or anger. I was doing it because it was what I had to do to protect myself. So, I set up my phone on the little table in front of me, my hands trembling as I pressed record. The camera's lens stared back at me, blank and expectant, like a silent witness to the words I was about to speak. I took a deep breath and began. "Emily, I don't know if you'll ever listen to this, but I'm hoping you will. I've thought long and hard about what I'm about to say, and I need you to understand, fully, why I've made the decisions I have." I paused for a moment, the words heavy in my mouth, but I pushed through. "When we spoke last, I asked for something so simple. I just wanted to be closer to you. I didn't ask to live with you or to burden you. I only wanted to be near my daughter, to feel like I mattered to someone again." But what I got in return was something I never expected. Not from you, not from the person I had spent my life caring for. The tears stung, but I blinked them away, swallowing the lump in my throat. I had no room for weakness now. I couldn't let the hurt consume me, not anymore. You told me you couldn't deal with it. And worse, I heard Daniel's voice, saying we weren't running an elderly hostel. I can't even begin to explain how that felt. To hear my own flesh and blood speak about me like I was nothing more than a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. I took another deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I used to be. But I was still hurt, still wounded by the lack of compassion, by the way they so easily dismissed me. You see, Emily, the thing is, I never wanted to be a burden to you. I never wanted to be the one you had to take care of. I've spent my life taking care of others, your father, you, everyone around me, and when the time came that I needed help, I expected nothing more than some understanding. Some care. But what I got instead was rejection. And that's not something I can just forget. I paused, my hands now gripping the table, the words coming with more strength, more clarity. I know you have your own life, your own family, and I've always respected that. But the truth is, Emily, you've made it clear to me that I am no longer a part of that. I don't fit into your world anymore, and that's okay. I understand that now. What I've realized is that I need to protect myself. I can't keep waiting around for people who don't care about me, for people who turn their backs when things get difficult. I wiped my face, surprised by the tears that had slipped down my cheeks, though they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of something else, acceptance maybe, or the beginning of peace. I have changed my will, Emily. Everything I own, everything I've worked for is no longer yours. It's gone. I've given it to charity, women's shelters, elderly care homes, places that take care of people like me, people who have been forgotten, people who have no one else. You may never understand why I did this, but I'm doing it to protect myself, to take back the little bit of control I still have. The silence that followed my words felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. But I knew, deep down, that this was the right decision. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Emily. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about setting boundaries, about refusing to be discarded. I don't expect you to understand. I don't know if you'll ever be able to. But I need you to know this. I'm doing this because I deserve more than to be treated like an inconvenience. I deserve to live my life, to die with some peace, without the weight of being unwanted. The camera was still rolling, and I stared into the lens, not as a mother speaking to her daughter, but as a woman who had taken back control of her own story. This is the last time I'll ask anything of you, Emily. Don't try to make things right, don't send me flowers, don't tell me you're sorry. What's done is done. I've made my choices and I'm living with them. This is the life I have now, and it's mine to live. I pressed stop on the recording, the weight of the words finally leaving my chest. It felt like something had been lifted. I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I wasn't chasing after a love that had faded away. I was moving forward on my own terms. As I sat back in the chair, my hands resting in my lap, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper. Something that made me realize that I no longer needed Emily's forgiveness or her approval. I had found my peace. After I sent the video, I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen of my phone, feeling an odd mixture of exhaustion and emptiness. The weight of my words hung heavy in the air, but there was no sense of triumph, no rush of satisfaction. I had expected to feel something more, some kind of victory or vindication. But the truth was, I felt nothing. I didn't feel the relief I thought would come from making Emily understand, from showing her the consequences of her actions. I didn't feel the rush of I've done it, I've taken back control. No, instead, what I felt was something quieter, something deeper, peace. A calm that settled over me, even as the emptiness of the apartment around me pressed in. I had no illusions. I knew Emily would be angry. She might even resent me for what I had done. I didn't expect her to understand the reasons behind my actions, nor did I think she would ever apologize. But what mattered now was that I had finally taken a stand for myself. I had stopped being the person who waited for others to validate her worth. I had stopped looking for approval from someone who had turned away when I needed it most. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. I didn't want Emily's inheritance to feel like a punishment, but I also knew that leaving it to her would mean nothing to her now. It would only feed into the pattern of neglect, the pattern where she saw me as someone who could be ignored. It was time to break that cycle, time to show her that I didn't need her to define my worth. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel proud of myself for doing it. It was not a decision I made lightly. I had spent years of my life giving, sacrificing, hoping for a return, hoping for some sense of family, some connection. But in the end, the only thing that mattered was the respect I had for myself. That's what this was really about. Protecting my dignity. I had always been the one to give, to care, to make sure that everyone else was all right. But now, in this quiet apartment with nothing but my own thoughts for company, I realized that it was time to protect myself. To make sure that I didn't lose myself in the process of giving, I sat still for a while, the silence around me thick with my thoughts. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad, not anymore. But there was a lingering ache, a quiet sorrow for the daughter I had hoped would always be there, for the family I had imagined would be there to support me as I grew older. I had wanted so badly to believe that we would always be close, that the bond we shared would be unbreakable. But now I understood. Bonds can fray, people change, and sometimes you are left with nothing but the remnants of what was. I didn't hate Emily, not at all, but I also didn't want to live in a world where I had to beg for her love, where I had to prove myself worthy of it. I was done. I had given enough. Now I was giving only to myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I had taken control of my own story, not through anger, but through the quiet act of choosing myself. I had chosen my own peace. I had chosen to respect myself enough to no longer be anyone's burden, no longer be someone who could be ignored, forgotten. I didn't need their forgiveness. I didn't need their approval. What I needed was my own approval. And in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. The video, the changes to the will, all of it, it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my respect, and my dignity. And as I sat there, the weight of it all lifted. I knew that, despite the loneliness that would come with it, I was finally free. Free from the expectations of others. Free from the need to prove my worth. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give myself. A month had passed since I made the changes. A month of quiet reflection, of settling into my new life, one that was both solitary and serene. I had become accustomed to the silence in my apartment. The peaceful stillness that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like a comforting companion. The world outside continued on, but I had found my own rhythm, my own place, free from the expectations of others. I was in the middle of reading a book one afternoon when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I wondered if it was a neighbor or maybe someone from the senior center stopping by, but when I opened the door, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. It was Emily. She stood there, her face drawn and tired, her eyes tired and red, as if she had been crying or hadn't slept. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt thicker than it ever had before, heavy with unspoken words, with everything that had been left unsaid. I felt the old pang of sadness rise in my chest. Part of me wanted to welcome her, to let her in and wrap my arms around her like I had always done, but I resisted. I couldn't let my emotions rule me again. Not now. Not after everything. "Mom," Emily finally said, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk? I need to explain some things." I stepped aside, silently allowing her to enter, though my mind was already racing. What could she possibly have to say? Was this the apology I had been hoping for, or was it something else? She had never once reached out in the weeks that had passed, not even a phone call. But here she was, standing in front of me, and I couldn't ignore the way my heart tightened at the sight of her. It was hard to be indifferent, to shut off the maternal instinct that had always been there, always willing to forgive, always ready to protect. We sat down at the small table in my kitchen, the same place where I had made my decision, where I had come to terms with the painful truth that Emily was no longer the daughter I had hoped for. "I know I haven't been in touch," she started, her words coming slowly, as if weighing each one before speaking. "And I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." I listened, waiting for her to continue, the silence between us filling with tension. I had no idea where this conversation was going, but I could feel the discomfort radiating from her. "Mom, things haven't been good. Financially, Daniel and we've been struggling. We've made some bad investments, lost a lot of money, and it's been hard to keep up with everything. We're really in a tough spot right now," she admitted, her voice soft, almost ashamed. The words hit me like a wave crashing over a rocky shore. I could feel my pulse quicken as the realization sank in. This wasn't a visit for reconciliation. This wasn't a moment where Emily had come to seek forgiveness or offer an apology. No, this was about something else entirely. "Wait," I said, my voice quiet but sharp, the edge of disbelief clear. "Are you saying you came here because of money?" She nodded, her gaze falling to the table, unable to meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom, I know it sounds terrible, I don't know how else to say it. Daniel. He's been hiding things from me, and now it's all falling apart. The investments, the debts, everything. We thought we could fix it, but it's worse than we thought." The words felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about making amends, about rebuilding any kind of connection. This was about desperation. This was about them seeing me as a resource, someone who might help, someone who could fix their problems. I swallowed the lump in my throat, but I couldn't help the bitter taste that rose in my mouth. "So, after everything," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "after everything that's happened, you're here now because you need something from me." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on the table. "I never wanted it to be like this, Mom, but we don't know where else to turn. We've been struggling for months, and it's only getting worse." I sat there stunned. The room felt small, the walls closing in as the weight of the situation settled in. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it from her lips felt like the final betrayal. Emily wasn't here to apologize. She wasn't here to make amends or to express any real remorse for how she had treated me. She was here because she had no other option, because she needed help. Help that, once again, wasn't about love or connection, but about convenience. It wasn't the first time I had been used. I had been the one they called when they needed something. I had been the one who always gave, always sacrificed. And now, when they were in trouble, they saw me only as a solution to their problems, not as the woman who had been a mother, a friend, a support system. I looked at Emily, trying to keep my face neutral, trying not to let the hurt show, but I knew she could see it. I wasn't sure what to say. The words that came to mind weren't kind, and I couldn't let myself go down that path. "I'm sorry to hear that you're struggling," I said, finally breaking the silence, my voice cold and composed. "But I can't help you, Emily. I can't give you what you want." Her face fell, and for the first time in this conversation, I saw a glimpse of something real. Guilt, regret, maybe even shame. But it wasn't enough to change anything. "I've already made my choices," I continued, my voice steady, "and I'm not going to undo them. I'm not here to be your safety net, Emily, not anymore." She looked at me, her face contorted in frustration, but I didn't care. I had made my peace. I had set boundaries that I would no longer let her or anyone else cross. "You don't understand," Emily said, her voice tight with emotion. "We're desperate. We don't know what to do." "I understand more than you think," I said quietly, standing up from the table. "I just don't think you understand what you've done." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to. Emily stayed sitting at the table, her eyes on the floor, the weight of the moment settling between us. I walked to the door, opened it, and without another word, I left her to face the consequences of her actions. As Emily left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weight of her visit, the desperation in her eyes, it all seemed to center around one thing: money. I had already decided I wasn't going to help. But as the minutes passed, my mind wandered back to what she had said, her words replaying in my head like a broken record. She had never once asked me how I was doing, never once shown real concern for me beyond her financial needs. I realized that I hadn't just been rejected, I had been used. And then a thought struck me, sharp and sudden. Something about her visit, about her words, didn't sit right. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was more to this than just money. What was Daniel's role in all of this? He was the one who had spoken so harshly about me, the one who had dismissed me so easily. He had never once tried to reach out, never once tried to make things right with me. Why? It didn't take long before I decided to dig deeper. I couldn't just let it go. I wasn't sure why, but something about Daniel's attitude toward me, his indifference, felt like a puzzle piece I needed to put in place. I spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, then finally I made the call. I reached out to a friend of mine who worked at a local bank, someone who had always been kind to me, someone I could trust. I didn't want to get involved, but I needed to understand why Emily and Daniel had acted the way they did. I had to know if they had lied, if they had been deliberately deceiving me about everything. My friend agreed to help, though she was hesitant, telling me it was a bit unconventional. I didn't care. I had to know the truth about everything. A few days later, she called me back. "I've got the information you asked for," she said, her voice tight. "But you might not like what you hear." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "It's Daniel," she said. "He's been hiding something from you, from Emily. They've been lying to her about your financial situation, making her think you're struggling, that you can't handle things on your own." My heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying? What has Daniel done?" "He's been making it sound like you're in worse shape than you actually are," she explained. "He convinced Emily that you needed financial help, that you were unable to live independently. The truth is, your finances are fine, Sarah. You've been able to manage on your own, but Daniel didn't want Emily to see that. He made her believe you were helpless." I sat down hard, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. Daniel had lied. He had made Emily believe I was incapable of managing my own life, of taking care of myself. Why? What could he possibly gain from this? "It's not just about money, is it?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's been manipulating her and me." "Exactly," my friend said. "He needed Emily to feel guilty, to think that she was responsible for you, that you couldn't live without her help. That way, he could keep his grip on the situation. He didn't want Emily questioning things, didn't want her to see the truth about how capable you actually are. He made it look like you were desperate." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't just that Emily and Daniel had turned their backs on me. It was worse than that. Daniel had actively worked to manipulate her into believing I was helpless, that I was some kind of burden to them. He had used my vulnerability, my grief, my fear of loneliness, to deceive Emily, to make her think I needed help, when the truth was far from it. The anger I felt was different this time. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was a deep, burning fury, not only at Daniel but at Emily for falling for it, for allowing herself to be manipulated in such a way. I paced back and forth in my apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. I had been living in this quiet solitude, trying to heal, trying to rebuild my life, when in the background, Daniel had been orchestrating this entire web of lies. He had made sure that Emily would never see me for what I truly was. Strong, independent, capable. Instead, he had painted a picture of a helpless woman, someone she had to save, someone she had to manage. And now, here I was, once again, caught in a game I didn't even know was being played. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just ignore the fact that Daniel had done this to me, to Emily. I had to confront him, but I knew it wouldn't be easy, not after everything that had happened. But I also knew one thing. I wouldn't let him get away with it. Not now. Not ever. After everything that had happened, after the betrayal from Emily and Daniel, I knew I had to do something. Something that would give my life meaning again, something that would turn the anger and disappointment I felt into something tangible, something that could make a difference. I had been feeling lost, caught between the past I couldn't let go of and the future I was still trying to build, but now I had a purpose. And it was a purpose that didn't involve them. It didn't involve anyone who had turned their back on me. One night, while sitting at my small kitchen table, I made the decision. I would create something that would stand as a testament to my strength and my refusal to be forgotten. A legacy. I pulled out the papers I had kept all this time, the legal documents, the charity brochures I had accumulated over the years, and I began writing. It wasn't just a charity. It wasn't just a way to give away the money I had no intention of leaving to Emily. No, this was a mission. A mission to help those like me, the elderly who were left behind, those who had no one to care for them, who had been abandoned by their families just like I had been. And so, the Steady Hands Foundation was born. It wasn't just a name I had chosen on a whim. The name meant something. It symbolized the strength that I had found within myself and the strength I knew others needed in their darkest moments. It represented the steady hands of the volunteers and workers who would carry the weight of those who had been left alone. It would be a support system for those who had nowhere else to turn, a place where people like me could find hope, even when their own families had walked away. The foundation would be funded entirely by the estate I had once planned to leave to Emily. Every penny of it, every asset, would go toward helping those who needed it most, the forgotten, the abandoned, the elderly who had no one to care for them. I reached out to local organizations, to senior care homes, to shelters, anyone who would listen. The response was overwhelming. There were people who shared my vision, who saw the importance of giving the elderly a place to belong, a community that didn't just see them as a burden. I wasn't doing this out of bitterness, not really. I wasn't doing this to punish Emily or Daniel, though I knew they would feel the loss. I was doing this because I had learned that the greatest thing I could give to myself, and to the world, was not money, not material things. It was compassion. It was the recognition that we all deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter our age or our circumstances. With the support of those local organizations, I established the foundation. The goal was clear: to provide housing, medical care, and companionship to the elderly who had been cast aside. I wanted them to have a place where they felt valued, where they didn't have to suffer alone, where they could live out their years with the respect they deserved. But I didn't stop there. I knew the truth about Emily and Daniel couldn't stay hidden forever. I had already made the changes to my will. I had already taken back control of my own legacy. But now, I was ready to let the world know why I had done it. I reached out to a local reporter, someone I trusted, and I asked if she would help me tell my story. The truth had to come out. The world needed to know how Emily and Daniel had treated me, how they had used me as a pawn in their own lives, and how I had been pushed aside when I was no longer convenient. I agreed to an interview, and when the reporter arrived, I sat down and told her everything. The coldness of Emily's rejection, the manipulation by Daniel, how they had deliberately kept me in the dark about their financial situation, how they had made me seem helpless when I wasn't. I told her about the decision to change my will and to put my money into something that would truly make a difference. The article that followed was titled, "What My Daughter Taught Me About Dying Alone and Living on My Own Terms." It spread quickly, first among the community, then across social media, as people shared the story of a mother who had been left behind but refused to let it define her. The foundation received donations from strangers who were moved by the story. People reached out from all over, asking how they could help, how they could contribute. The Steady Hands Foundation wasn't just a charity, it was a movement. It was the proof that I had made the right choice, that I had taken the pain, the betrayal, and turned it into something powerful. Emily called me after the article was published. I didn't pick up the phone. I wasn't interested in hearing the excuses, the apologies that were no longer meaningful. She had had her chance. Instead, I focused on what really mattered. The foundation was growing. The elderly who had been abandoned now had a place to turn to, a community that cared, and that was the legacy I wanted to leave behind. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something meaningful. I wasn't waiting for approval. I wasn't chasing after love that wasn't mine to have. I was giving what I could to people who needed it most, and in doing so, I found a sense of purpose and peace I had never known before. And so, in the end, the pain of betrayal had led me to something greater, something more important than any inheritance or apology. It had led me to find my own strength, and to use it to help others find theirs. It was a quiet afternoon when I sat down to write the article. I had already shared my story with the reporter, but this time, I knew it needed to come directly from me. It wasn't just about the foundation or the changes I had made. It was about the message I wanted to send, about the truth I had been holding in for so long. I wanted the world to know what had happened. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because I knew that my story was not unique. There were other people like me, older adults, discarded by their families, forgotten in a world that moves too fast to look back. I wanted to give voice to those people. I wanted them to know that they weren't alone. I took a deep breath and began to write. The words came slowly at first, but as I found my rhythm, I realized this was the most important thing I had ever written. The pen felt steady in my hand, each word carrying weight and meaning. I wasn't just telling my story. I was telling the story of anyone who had been left behind, anyone who had been treated as invisible, as nothing. Here's what I wrote. It's not easy to admit that the people you've loved and cared for your entire life no longer see you. The pain of realizing that your own flesh and blood would turn their back on you when you needed them the most is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. But it's a pain that I, unfortunately, came to know all too well. I am Sarah, a 74-year-old woman, a mother and a widow. I spent my life raising my daughter, Emily, with all the love and care I could give. I sacrificed for her, for my family, always putting their needs ahead of my own. I thought, as any mother would, that when the time came for me to need them, they would be there. But what I found was something far more painful than I could have ever imagined. When my health began to decline, when I could no longer drive or take care of myself the way I once could, I reached out to my daughter. I simply wanted to move closer to her, to not feel so alone. I didn't ask to move in with her, just to be nearby. I hoped that she would understand, that she would be there for me the way I had been there for her. Instead, I was met with coldness, a rejection that made me realize in the most painful way that I was no longer wanted. My daughter's response wasn't about love, wasn't about concern, it was about convenience. And when I heard her husband, Daniel, say that we weren't running an elderly hostel, it became crystal clear. I had become a burden. Someone to be dealt with when it suited them, but otherwise forgot. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt. It was the realization that, in the eyes of my family, I had ceased to be a person of value. I had given my life to caring for others, to making sure they were happy, healthy, and safe. But when the time came for me to ask for something as simple as companionship and support, I was left to fend for myself. And I realized that if I didn't take control of my life, no one else would. That was when I made a decision. I wouldn't live my life as a burden. I wouldn't let anyone else define my worth. Instead, I would use my experience to help others who had been abandoned by their families, people like me, who had been cast aside when they were no longer useful. I founded the Steady Hands Foundation, a charity dedicated to supporting elderly people who have no one to care for them. My decision to create this foundation was funded entirely by the estate I had once planned to leave to my daughter. It's not about the money, it's about the message I wanted to send, that no one, no matter their age, should ever feel that they are disposable, that they are invisible. This foundation is a testament to the power of self-respect and independence. I had spent my entire life taking care of everyone else, and now it was time to take care of myself. It was time to stand up for my own dignity, to ensure that I, and others like me, could live the rest of our lives with the respect we deserve. My story is not unique. I am not the only one who has been discarded, forgotten, left to live in silence. There are countless others who are treated as burdens, as if their lives no longer matter. I hope that by sharing my experience, I can raise awareness and help build a society where the elderly are not forgotten, where the ones who have built our world are cared for and loved until the end of their days. To my daughter, Emily, and to anyone who has ever been in my shoes, I hope you can find the strength to make your own decisions, to reclaim your dignity, and to never let anyone make you feel less than what you are. We all deserve the right to live with dignity, to live independently, and to live in a way that honors who we are, not what we can do for others. I finished the article, sat back in my chair, and exhaled slowly. It was done. The truth had been told, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever felt like they weren't enough, anyone who had been cast aside by those they loved. I wasn't looking for sympathy, I wasn't looking for forgiveness. What I wanted was for people to understand, to realize that no one should ever have to feel the way I did when I was told I was no longer wanted. I submitted the article to the local newspaper, and soon, it was published online. It spread through social media, and before long, it reached far beyond my small town. Strangers reached out to me, thanking me for sharing my story, for standing up for those who couldn't. The foundation grew, receiving more support than I could have imagined. But the most important thing was this: I had taken back my power. I had turned my pain into something that would help others. I wasn't just a victim of circumstances. I was a woman who had found a way to live on her own terms. And that, I realized, was the greatest freedom of all. The phone call came unexpectedly. I had been settling into my routine, feeling a sense of peace and purpose that I hadn't known in years. The foundation was thriving, and I was finally doing something that mattered, not just for me, but for others who had been forgotten. I had found my place, my voice, and I wasn't about to let anyone or anything take that away. But then the phone rang, and my heart sank when I saw the name on the screen. Emily. For a moment, I hesitated. It had been weeks since we last spoke, and I had convinced myself that I was done with the past. I had moved on from her rejection, from the hurt. I wasn't ready to let her back into my life, not yet, not after everything that had happened. But despite my better judgment, I picked up the phone. Hello. Hi, Mom. Emily's voice came through, softer than I expected, though it still had an edge of something I couldn't quite place. I know it's been a while. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the foundation, and about the changes you made. I stayed quiet, waiting. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the words I heard next surprised me. I just wanted to reach out, she continued. I know you've been upset with me, but I want to talk about the money, about the estate. I know things were changed in your will, and I just wanted to know if there's any chance we could revisit that. Maybe. You could reconsider, leaving me a part of it. I blinked, sitting up straighter, feeling the heat of anger rise in my chest. Of course, I thought bitterly. She's not here to apologize. She's here for the money. Emily, I said slowly, my voice steady but laced with disbelief. After everything that happened, after the way you and Daniel treated me, you're calling now about the estate, about the money. She sighed heavily on the other end of the line, as if my words had come as a disappointment. I know it sounds bad, but you have to understand. Things have been really hard for us. Daniel and I made some bad decisions, and now we're struggling. I just don't know where else to turn. I thought maybe, if you could help just a little, it would make a big difference. I felt my hands tremble, and I had to steady my breath. I wasn't sure what I had expected from this call, but it certainly wasn't this. She wasn't here for forgiveness. She wasn't here to make amends. She was here for the same thing she always came for, help. Emily, you've completely misunderstood everything, I said, my voice firmer now. This isn't about you being able to use me whenever you need something. This isn't about me offering you a safety net, like I've done for years. It's about respect. It's about honoring the choices I've made for myself. I paused, letting my words sink in. I wasn't angry, not like I had been before. I wasn't furious, but I was resolute. You've shown me that I was never a priority for you, that when I needed you, you weren't there. When I asked for something as simple as support and companionship, you turned your back. And now you think you can come to me, months later, and ask for part of what I've worked for. For what? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear Emily's shaky breath. She didn't respond immediately, and I could tell she was struggling to find the words that would make this situation go away. Mom, I know we've had our differences. I know I've messed up. But please, I just need some help. Daniel's been. He's been gambling. He's been hiding things, and I didn't know. Now everything's falling apart, and I don't know what else to do. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her words wash over me. I had heard enough. The manipulation was clear. She was still the same, using me as a solution, not as a mother to be loved and respected. You should have thought about that before, I said, my voice calm but firm. Before you let Daniel lead you into this mess. Before you turned your back on me when I needed you. I won't be your solution. I won't be your fallback. I paused, letting the finality of my words hang in the air between us. Emily, I made a decision for myself, and it's not about the money. It's about taking control of my life. About not letting people use me anymore. You've had your chance, and I've moved on. I'm sorry for what's happened, but I won't be part of your financial plans. Not anymore. She didn't speak for a long while, and when she finally did, it was a soft, almost broken voice. I'm sorry, Mom, I really am, I didn't know what else to do. Her apology was empty, and I knew it. It was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't going to let her or anyone else make me feel small again. Not for anyone. I know you're sorry, I said quietly, but it's not enough anymore. I hung up the phone, the silence that followed not empty, but full. Full of a decision I had made for myself. Full of the weight of the truth I had lived with. And as I sat there, I knew one thing for certain. I was done being used. I was done sacrificing my dignity for the sake of others. As Sarah's story comes to a close, we find her in a place she never thought possible, a place of peace and self-respect. After years of giving, of sacrificing herself for the people she loved, Sarah found herself abandoned when she needed support the most. Her daughter, Emily, and her husband, Daniel, turned away from her, leaving her to question her worth and her place in their lives. But instead of allowing herself to be consumed by anger or bitterness, Sarah made a life-changing decision. She chose to reclaim her dignity, to stop waiting for love and validation from people who couldn't offer it. She founded the Steady Hands Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping the elderly who have been abandoned by their families, a cause close to her heart. The foundation became her legacy, a living testament to the strength and resilience she had always carried within herself. It wasn't just about the money or the assets she had once planned to leave to her daughter. It was about the message she sent to the world. That every person, no matter their age, deserves to be treated with respect, with care, and with love. But Sarah's journey didn't stop there. She stood her ground, making it clear to Emily that her own peace and self-respect were more important than any financial obligation. Emily's attempts to manipulate Sarah back into her life were met with quiet, firm resistance. Sarah knew that the only way forward was to protect herself, to no longer be seen as a source of convenience or obligation. And in the end, Emily came to realize that her mother was no longer someone she could control or take advantage of. The story of Sarah is one of growth, empowerment, and the importance of standing up for oneself. It is a story of reclaiming independence and dignity in the face of betrayal and neglect. Sarah found her peace, not by clinging to the past, but by embracing the future she had the power to create on her own terms. Respect is not something you can ask for, it's something you must protect. When family fails to show care, know that you can stand on your own and find your value in those who truly care. In the end, Sarah's journey teaches us a vital lesson. We are not defined by the people who choose to abandon us, but by how we choose to move forward. Even in the most difficult times, we have the power to reclaim our lives, to protect our dignity, and to build relationships with those who see our worth.